Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Carol Booth Olson. I'm a professor in the School of Education at UCI, the director of the UCI Writing Project, and the director of the Wright Center, a new research and development center focused on the study of secondary writing that is funded by the U.S. Department of Education Institute of Education Sciences. This is the third of 3 live stream events that we have put together to launch the center. And all 3 of our presenters have been advisory board members for the Wright Center: Jim Burke, Kelly Gallagher, and Carol Jago, 3 acclaimed teacher scholars who've had just an amazing impact on the teaching of literacy in the United States. I'm especially excited to introduce my friend Carol Jago today, because in our institute, we have an advanced institute going this summer, and we are doing an inquiry into what it means to be a teacher leader. And I can think of no better role model for how to be a teacher leader than Carol Jago. Carol and I go way back. We were introduced by a mutual friend when I was very new to UCI, and she was very new to Santa Monica High School. And I have watched her career trajectory with great interest. So within her school, she immediately became a leader, and she was department chair of her school for 19 years. Within the community, she immediately got a profile by writing a column for the LA Times about education, which all of us looked forward to. At the state level, she became very involved and instrumental in CATE, was a member of the CATE board, and became the editor of California English, which she still edits today. Within the California Subject Matter Projects, she became the associate director of the California Reading and Lit Project at UCLA, one of the sister projects to our writing project here at UCI. She then moved to the national level, where she got involved in the National Council of Teachers of English, ultimately to become their president. In the textbook industry, she was working with Houghton Mifflin, raising the quality of textbooks that we have to teach our kids. And in the policy arena, she became involved with NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and also is a consultant to the College Board. So her reach has been pretty incredible. All the while, she was voraciously reading and prolifically writing books. If you know Carol, she is a fount of knowledge about books. So from NCTE, she was writing Nikki Giovanni in the classroom, Sandra Cisneros in the classroom, Alice Walker in the classroom. For Heinemann, she was writing With Rigor for All, which Kelly Gallagher gave a shout out last week as his most all-time favorite professional book ever. Papers, the Come to Class, Lessons for High School Writers, many, many more. And today she's going to be talking about her newest book, The Book in Question. If you click on this book on the Wright Center website, it will take you to the Heinemann website so you can see about the book. And you will notice that under that book, there's a little place where it says, would you like to be informed of future events? So we have a small dilemma. We have launched these live streams to begin to build a community of interest for the Wright Center, and they've been very successful. We've had over 800 viewers for our first 2 sessions, and those are just the viewers. Like if you were at an institute and you logged on, you might have had 25 people in the room. However, our live stream system cannot capture who you are, and therefore we don't know who you are to tell you about future events. NCTE was great in announcing this first series of live streams, but mainly because of Carol. So we have to find a way to get in touch with you and let you know of future events. For example, October 24th, we're going to be launching an event on research-based, evidence-based writing instruction with Steve Graham, the author of Writing Next, with a panel with Judith Langer, David Pearson, Carol Jago, Mary Schleppegrell, Jennifer Fletcher, and many more eminent members of our advisory board. We want to let you know about that event. So to entice you, if you sign up today and give us your email address, and we promise not to sell you anything, we are going to choose 25 of those names and contact you and ask you to pick which of the 3 books from this session you would like to have a copy of and mail it to you. You can also participate on a chat feature. You can send your questions through a question box. And last week we had a question coming all the way from London, so that was kind of fun. And there's another place where there's question. Oh, you can tweet on Right Center Live. So we'd love to have you participate. So before I turn it over to Carol, just one brief anecdote I wanted to tell. So I once had the pleasure of having dinner with Carol and Dan Kirby, and they engaged in something I would call either dueling books or the battle of the voracious readers. And so one of them would say, well, have you read X? And she'd go, of course I have, but I bet you haven't read Y. Well, what about Z? Meanwhile, I got out my napkin and my pen, and as fast as I could, I was writing down the names of books. So get ready. You're going to be writing down the names of a lot of books. Please welcome our very good friend, Carol Jago.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, thank you. And I really wanted to second Carol's encouragement to use that chat box. For those of you who are sitting at home on your laptop the way I was last week at Kelly's, it's a way to be part of this community. The other thing I want to say, when Carol, people actually don't need to write on their napkins because my slideshow is yours. So any books I talk about will be right there that you'll be able to see it. Now, one of the things that I believe we're involved in right now is that in this last standards movement, we all became obsessed with the idea of what students should know and be able to do. You know, that mantra of college and career readiness. And please do not hear in what I'm saying anything against standards. I believe standards have brought coherence, consistency, transparency to our work. But, in our laser-like focus on writing standard 27C, we have somehow lost sight of what it is we want students to be. Readers and writers. Readers and writers who can and choose to read and write. Not for the grade, not for a test score, but for themselves. And if we lose sight of that goal, I think we will lose our way. That teachers like yourselves who will choose in the middle of the summer like this to spend an hour on professional development will go elsewhere with your time and energy. And I wanted to make this time that we have together to help us think about what this means to help students to be readers and writers. Now, one other aspect of this that I've found is that, in my experience as a classroom teacher, 32 years at Santa Monica High School, I have taught many, many good readers who were actually weak writers. They were kids like me, one and done, hand it in, I just want to get back and read another book. But I've never taught a good writer who wasn't a reader. Why? Because there are so many things about good writing that you'll never have enough days to teach it. Mini lessons, maxi lessons, things about the rhythm of a sentence, about word choice, how many times can you teach parallel structure? And yet kids who don't read don't understand that cumulative nature of what happens when parallel structure is done right. And that's why mentor texts are so critical in this work. But again, we need to be careful. I don't know why it is, but we in education have this penchant for taking a good idea and turning it into something stupid. And that is what we've done with mentor text. We just hand kids a mentor text and we say, imitate it. No, it doesn't really work that way. The teacher needs to say, students, let's look at why this writer made those choices. Why this writer is using alliteration. Why a comma and not a long dash. Why? And in that way, you draw out from students an awareness of all the choices that a writer makes every time he or she puts pen to paper. Because you see, I think that we absolutely need to stop telling students that that writing is fun. Not because it can't be, but what happens when you say writing is fun? You're putting it in competition with pizza and Fortnite. And you know who's going to lose in that comparison. And in fact, you know, as Carol mentioned, I've written 14 some books. I wrote endless columns on education. And I want to tell you, I hate to write. I'd rather go to the dentist than sit down and write. Why? Because it's hard. Because it requires every brain cell I possess to do to write. And so we need to be honest with students about how challenging good writing is. Because I suspect that particularly some of our most struggling writers, they believe that people are just born writing. And that mentor text you showed them, that Joyce Carol Oates just sat there and dictated from some writing god up in the sky. Whereas that is absolutely not how fine writing comes into the world. And so do you see how we work against ourselves when we tell students writing is fun? I can make it easy for you, instead of acknowledging the real struggle that good writing honestly and truly entails. I also think that this relates to the Carol Dweck's work with mindset. I know everybody in the room and across America has had more PD than you really want to think about on mindset and a growth mindset. And in fact, Angela Duckworth's real genius in terms of operationalizing this Carol Dweck's research was coming up with this word grit. I mean, it's just a cool, sexy word. And do you think her book would have been a bestseller if she'd called it academic perseverance? I don't think so. She herself, Angela Duckworth, in a recent interview in Education Leadership, talks about how the problem is we're right now at a moment where the practice has gotten ahead of the science. So you've got whole middle schools where kids are wearing grit t-shirts and they're filling in grit worksheets, and the principal comes over the PA and says, "Students, let's be gritty today." This is ridiculous. You can't teach grit the way you teach the Civil War or photosynthesis. Yet there are classrooms where students are behaving in gritty ways. And so the challenge now is to unpack some of that. So what is it about some classrooms? And Paul Tough, in his book, Helping Children Succeed, he also wrote a piece in The Atlantic that's not behind a firewall that explains this. He decided to go out and visit these classrooms where students were behaving in gritty ways and to find out, well, what's going on? And what did he find? That students feel they belong in this academic community. Key word there, community. If we don't build community in our classrooms, we're not really teaching. And think about why. Students have their ability and competence grow with effort. They believe they can succeed. In order to grow, in order to improve, you need to take chances. And nobody takes chances if you don't feel safe. You don't raise your hand if you're too afraid of getting it wrong. And in writing, you don't even turn in your paper because you know it's no good. And that's where I was so impressed last week when Kelly was talking about that our input as writing teachers needs to be along the way and not just at the end telling students what honestly many of them already know, that their final product isn't the best they could do. And again, I think about myself as a writer and how I feel when somebody asks me to write a blog post. So thinking of it like a teacher assigns a paper in class. My first reaction is, no, I don't want to do this. But I always say yes, because I know that the act of writing that blog post is going to inform me. William Stafford, I'm going to butcher his language here, but talks about a writer isn't so much someone who has something to say, but rather someone who's discovered a process that leads to the discovery of what it is you want to express. Again, William Stafford says it much more eloquently. This is my restatement of it. But it goes to the heart. I am a better teacher for writing about my practice. And one of the things that I learned over the course of all those years, every Sunday night, writing an essay, is, well, for the first year, I was just waving my finger at the world, telling parents what to do. And then you kind of run out of things to say. And my husband, who is also a writer, said, Carol, point that finger back at yourself. And so what I started to do was simply telling stories from my classroom. And in the course of telling this maybe troubling story about what I was seeing, I began to figure it out. And I began better to understand my own practice. This is what can happen with our students as well. The reason that reading and writing are so intertwined is also that every piece of writing I have ever done, I had to do some reading. I had to do some research for it. One reason so many of our students write so poorly is they don't know what they're writing about. They don't actually have enough to say. They haven't invested themselves in learning more about what already has been said about the subject that they're going to write about. So all of this brings us to this dilemma, that kids today, you've been teaching as long as I have, you go to a dinner party and somebody's always saying, so what are kids like today? And the subtext of that question is kids are going to hell in a handbasket. But honestly, kids have always been wacky. They've always been wonderful. They've always made me laugh. They've always made me tear my hair out. But there is something different today. And that has to do with the digital age. The impetus for writing the book, my new book, the book in question, is that as I travel around the country talking with teachers, everybody's giving up. They're wringing their hands. They're saying kids won't write. They just want to tweet. Kids won't read. They just are on their phones all the time. No, there is a lot we can do. And that's what I wanted to give teachers ideas about all the things we can do, including helping students become more metacognitive about their own practices on their phones. I found this piece of verse, my device, I used to find it charming, I used to think it nice, but now I am a prisoner of my own device. I needed to take pictures, I needed to play games, remember all my numbers, remember all my names. It tells me where I'm going, it gives me all my news, it plays me all my music. Yeah, it buys me all my shoes. Yeah. Now this is the stanza that I think has import for us as teachers. I once had conversations with people that I met. It used to make me nervous. It used to make me sweat. Now I can ignore them and look down at my screen. They don't even notice. They're doing the same thing. My device is smarter than everyone I meet. It knows all the answers. You're all obsolete. Sam Weinberg at Stanford has a new book out called Why Learn History When It's Already on Your Phone? And of course, his book is an argument that there's much more to learning history than what you find on your phone. But I think that we need to think and to help students think about the world, the digital world, because children ages 5 to 10 spend on average 5.5 hours each day using media. Our secondary students, so the Pew Research Center does a survey every 2 years And in 2018, they found that 95% of teens report they have a smartphone, and 45 of those say they're online almost all the time. What's most shocking about these numbers is that just 2 years ago, when they did the survey in 2016, those numbers were like 76% and 23%. So this means today, in 2019, 100% of our teenagers are online 100% of the time. And this is changing how young people are doing adolescence. Jean Twenge wrote what I think is an iconic article, and I would just really recommend it for you to use it with students. Again, it's not behind a firewall. So she's a professor at San Diego State University, a psychologist who studies generational behavior, so millennials, Generation X, and she calls the students that we're teaching right now iGen. And she posits that they are different from students even 3 years ago. So I taught 10th grade for 100 years. And 10th grade is about 15-year-olds turning 16 and on their 16th birthday having an appointment at the DMV. Kids aren't getting their licenses anymore. Why? Because their world isn't out there at the mall. It's right here in their hands. So many of the students we'll meet in August, September, they're spending the summer in their bedroom with their phone. There are good things about this. Teenage pregnancy is down. They're not meeting face to face. But it's having an impact on relationships. So a 12-year-old she interviewed talked about, I think we're more comfortable with our phones than with our friends. I was reading research that middle school students losing the ability to read facial cues because so much of their communication is screen to screen. And these are things that we cannot control. Let's be clear. But that we are responsible, I believe, for helping students think through for themselves what is happening. And what Jean Twenge worries most about, and this is an article she just wrote in March for Education Week, is the dramatic rise in student depression. And what her comment is, we have to be careful. It's not causal, it's correlation. But it's very unusual to see changes this large happen in such a short period of time. And we need to, as teachers, to help students think about things. So for example, you assign a writing assignment. Ask kids, work on your drafts tonight at home. And every student in your class has a phone. And as they're writing, it's right next to them. And every 30 seconds, the phone goes, they get a text message. No 16-year-old I ever met isn't going to look down and read that text message. But that means when they come back to their draft, they've lost their train of thought. It makes that work harder, and they have to begin again. And so it takes longer. We can't take the phones away from kids, but what if you just suggested to them, let's do an experiment. Tonight, when you're working on your draft, just put your phone in the other room and see if it doesn't help you be able to compose with greater focus. I personally always had difficulty having students write in class simply because I'm not a very good disciplinarian and I have a hard time keeping the room quiet enough for me to be writing. And so, so unless it's a timed writing where it's, you've put some stakes on it, that people are chatting, and maybe it's good chat, maybe it's not. By the way, I want to tell you about a trick that I pull on my students. I think that being an accomplished teacher is often being a master trickster. So I was very frustrated by the number of times I'd planned a really complex peer revision, peer commentary lesson, and only 5 kids came in with drafts. So I said, I know what I'm going to do next time. And I assigned an in-class writing assignment. Kids write for 55 minutes. I collect all the papers and do nothing with them. I come back to class the next day and say, students, I've decided to let you revise your paper. Yay! Oh, Mrs. Jago, you're so nice. No, I'm not so nice. I just tricked everybody who was here yesterday into having a draft. Now, I bet you're thinking you could only do this once a year. Oh, no, they forget. they forget. And all of it, we're tricking kids to get for their own best selves. There's one more piece of this. The Common Sense Media Study recently came out with a report about teenagers taking their phones to bed with them at night. And this is interruptive of their sleep, which is then, again, deteriorating their ability to be alert with you, to be on. Anybody think about your period 1 class, what that's like, and kids can't wake up. And, I know that the world is full of smart people recommending that school starts later. This will never happen. And it will never happen for the practical reasons of buses, delivering kids, and athletic events after school. So I'm just this pragmatic person. I'm not going to fight that battle. I can accept that, yes, it would be better for most teenagers not to start school at 7:30, but, well, at least in my lifetime, this is not going to happen. Why is this troubling for student development? Well, as Nicholas Carr wrote in his book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. By the way, Nicholas Carr is the author of that iconic piece, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And he decided that Google was indeed making him stupid. He, a reader, a journalist, a writer his whole life, was finding it hard to concentrate and to read longer pieces. And so he unplugged himself, went up to a cabin in New Hampshire and wrote this book. And what he found is that the more time we spend online, the more incapable we seem to become of quiet reverie and the focused attention serious reading demands. Our brains are being rewired. So in the same way that people who read pictographic languages, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, their brains look different than ours because reading in those languages requires a heavier memory load. So are students for whom reading is that thumb roll. The thumb roll you use on your phone to read a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed. And a thumb roll, skimming and scanning, continuous partial attention, is an efficient and effective way to read a Twitter feed. But it is a terrible way to read William Shakespeare. And so as we increasingly are having students read on the same device that they're participating in social media, we need to help them see that it's not the device that should be determining their speed or how they read or the attention they're bringing to it, but rather the text itself and the purpose for their reading. Are they reading to garner evidence for a paper they're writing? Well, that's going to take a very different kind of attention. I saw this myself. I was reading a book by Eric Kleinenberg, a new book out called Palaces for the People. And it's about the importance of social infrastructure for communities to be cohesive, and then how social infrastructure is supported by public spaces, parks, libraries, barbershops, all of these places where people gather. I was reading this book in a hard copy, by the way, with a pencil in my hand. Not because I'm going to take a test on it, not because I'm even writing about this subject now, but because that work of holding a pencil in my hand as I read is helping me pay better attention. Every time I underline something, I'm reading it again. And that too is what I think we want to help students see. We're not just annotating in order to have a perfectly annotated paper. That's what you'd think if you watch it happening in classrooms, but rather to help ourselves focus, to help us slow down and do this work more thoroughly. So let's just take a minute. And folks online, just use that chat box. How do you see teaching and learning being affected by the digital age in your classrooms? In this room or in other writing project sites? The person with the shortest hair at your table, you start. Go. I have to tell you, as somebody who spends my life right now working to help teachers have rich and powerful conversations about teaching and learning, it is physically painful for me to say, please stop having your rich and powerful conversation and listen to me. But I want to take a metacognitive moment here. And that is to suggest, to argue, that what you will remember about what I just taught you from Jean Twenge and the Pew study and will be a result of what you just talked about. When we say, I don't have time for kids to talk in my class, in many ways we're saying, I don't have time for learning. Because the learning isn't taking place when you're talking. The learning's taking place when students do what you just did, which is tell stories. Tell stories from your own classroom, talk about thinking about your own use of your phone, your relationship with your phone. All of those stories are creating a space in your brain for new learning to stick. It's like new learning needs Velcro. You know, it needs a place to go. I mean, as I suggested earlier, how many times have you taught parallel structure? And you know, like in one ear, out the other, in one ear, out the other. No, but when you make new learning something that's meaningful for you, you hold on to it much more powerfully. Now, another person that I want to bring into this mix for you is Marianne Wolf. She's a neuroscientist. Kelly mentioned her last week as well, with a new book out called Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. She's currently at UCLA at Center X, working with us and trying to help us think about what this means. And what is so smart about her studies and her findings is it's not, oh, technology, bad, hard books, good. It's no, what our students need to develop is a biliterate reading brain. They need both to be fully competent and confident in every digital environment. All the papers they're going to turn in college are going to be submitted online. They need to know how to navigate Google Docs. They need to know all of those things. But at the same time, we can't let them lose what deep reading, close reading accomplishes. In an article that I strongly recommend that appeared last summer in The Guardian, and it's called Skim Reading is the New Normal, she talks about how the possibility that critical analysis, empathy, and other deep reading processes could become the unintended collateral damage of our digital culture is not a simple binary issue about print versus digital reading. We need to get over that. Like, we've had way too many conversations with, oh my God, I can't take my iPad into the bathtub. Who cares? There are times when it's good to have an e-reader. There are times when it's good to read on paper. Rather, it's about how we all have begun to read on any medium, and how that changes not only what we read, but also the purposes for why we read. Nor is it only about the young. The subtle atrophy of critical analysis and empathy affects us all. It affects our ability to navigate a constant bombardment of information. It incentivizes a retreat to the most familiar silos of unchecked information, which require and receive no analysis, leaving us susceptible to false information and demagoguery. If I were choosing one short article to bring to a faculty, an opening faculty meeting this really would be it. And the writing of this article is interesting as well. I had the good fortune, Marianne Wolf was speaking at UCLA at the Reading and Literature Project, and we were chatting at lunch, and she'd been asked by the Wall Street Journal to write a short op-ed piece about the substance of her book. It took her 2 weeks to write this piece. And then the Wall Street Journal rejected it without any comments. I mean, I think this is an interesting story in terms of how writers work. So she went back and revised it, and they still said no, again, with no commentary. So she says, heck with it, I'm sending it somewhere else. And she sent it to The Guardian. Not only did they publish it immediately, but it has had more shares and likes and been gone viral more than any other piece on this subject that they had. And so I tell that story. I hope Marianne Wolf isn't mad at me for telling it, but I think it has so much power for students as writers, and to see how their work is received. Remember last week Kelly Gallagher talking about it's not so much about evaluating student writing, it's about receiving that writing. In the book, she goes on to ask really important questions. Will the continuous demands for our attention and immediate access to voluminous information change the development of personal knowledge and affect our ability to make analogies, draw inferences, and arrive at independent judgments? All the things, how can you write without doing these things? Will the next generation, immersed in multitasking and digital mediums, learn to develop slower and essential cognitive processes of critical thinking and reflection? Will students write well without these skills? And I fear that they won't. Good writing requires reflection and slowing down, whereas everything about our phones and video games and all of the information coming at us just tells us to speed up, speed up, speed up. And I really believe that if we want students to reach for the stars, they're going to have to look up from their phones. Which brings me to another issue that I feel is impacting our classrooms, and that has to do with social emotional learning. Education Week market roundup reports that 90% of all school administrators are looking for programs on social emotional learning. Now, that's a good thing, social emotional learning. I mean, I don't know how you teach if you're not aware of your students socially and emotionally. But what worries me is that word programs. That if we're not careful, social emotional learning is going to turn into one more siloed thing for teachers to do. An opening 2 weeks on social emotional learning, as though kids need to be fixed, and then they just will stay fixed forever. Which I think is insulting to kids, and it's also, this goes back to some of the criticism that's now being leveled at grit initiatives, that it's not just about trying harder, there's more entailed. I also worry because of how it would then be delivered. For example, the idea of the 11 social emotional skills every kid should have. Like, there are only 11? And then take a minute and look at this list. And then just in your minds and in the chat room, just think of one or two others you might invite students to have at your tables. What are one or two other social emotional skills you think would be good for kids to have? Do you see how quickly something that is complex and subtle gets reduced to the 11 social emotional skills? And then now we're going to turn it into social emotional skill of the week, kind of letter of the week. And then pretty soon, and for every social emotional skill of the week, we're going to have a worksheet. Now, I just want to tell you that I did not search hard to find a terrible social emotional skills worksheet. I simply Googled social emotional worksheet, and this was the first one that came up. Could you imagine ever doing this? Asking students first about time they felt angry, and then checking the box. How did I respond? Hitting or kicking? Throwing objects? Cursing? Like, what? Would you want students to check these boxes? I mean, this is just not, and so what's the alternative if it's not about worksheets and about direct? We have in our hands the most perfect vehicle for teaching social emotional learning, and that is literature. Instead of asking students, turn to your partner and tell them something you've never told anybody before. Well, there's a reason I never told anybody, and I'm not going to tell you. Or asking kids, talk about the last time you shoplifted. This is ridiculous. Instead, have them read something. For example, Crime and Punishment, and talk about why Raskolnikov's taking an axe to the pawnbroker's head might have been a poor decision on his part and how that played out. That's the kind of thing. So I want to share with you a poem from that appeared in this week's Atlantic by the wonderful poet Jane Hirshfield. The Pawpaw. A woman speaks to me of a pawpaw tree. I have never seen a pawpaw tree. I have never eaten its fruit. I nod. The conversation continues. So many things we think we understand until we stop to think. Her life, my own. Let's think for a minute about what the social emotional import of this could be. How just thinking about that she doesn't know what a pawpaw tree is suggests all the other things that we don't know and that we take for granted based on the commonalities, but never seeing how much else there is around them. Now, I think that when we employ the magic of a piece of literature like this, we are opening up our classrooms to thinking. And so how do you get that thinking? One way is to ask students to write. So you have a short poem like this, and then say, instead, think about how most teachers teach poetry. Teacher reads a poem she loves to the class with feeling. Then, because this is a good teacher, she doesn't just say, where's the metaphor and what's the theme? She says, students, what do you think? Silence, not a hand. Everybody's kind of looking away, so you don't catch their eye. English teachers, we hate silence. So what do? We start talking about Jane Hirshfield and, and her background and what she writes about. And then we talk about pawpaw trees. And before you know it, the bell rings. And kids go, phew, for a minute there, I thought we were going to have to do something. But the problem is that they walk out through the door thinking, Mrs. Jago's really smart and I don't get poetry, which is the opposite of my purpose in that lesson. So what if instead you do read the poem to students, but then you say, just take a minute and reread the poem to yourself and just write for a couple of minutes about what do you think this poem wants us to know? By the way, I stole that question from an extraordinary teacher, Kenyatta Rogers, who is working right now in Chicago at the Poetry Foundation. And I just think it's a brilliant question to ask. What do you think this poem wants us to know? Because it gets away from asking about the speaker in the poem. It gets away from asking about the poet or the theme. Yeah, themes, stop asking kids what the theme is. I know it comes up on tests, but really, it's really hard. I can remember being in 11th grade. I was a really good student. I went to all girls Catholic school. I was Miss A student. And the nun, this is how long ago it is, in full wimple, she's asking the class, so what is the theme? I had done the reading. Not a clue. And then she'd say it, and I'd say, that's, of course. So I thought that when you got to be a teacher, you got this book with all the themes in it. So instead, let students use writing as a place to discover where their thinking is. Because what happens too often is that we ask a question, and don't you know the 3 kids whose hands go up? I know, because that would have always been me. Teacher asks a question, I have something to say, and at least it's interesting to me. And that's not necessarily the most thoughtful, the smartest kid, and also we are here in California where class size is 30, 40, we need to get past those 3 students because for the most part, they're going to be fine anyway. Those are the risk takers we were talking about, and we need to get beyond. So if then you have students, don't read what you've written to your partner, but read the poem again and talk about it. So you're using the writing to facilitate small group conversations. And then you can begin to pull this all together and call on someone. And then I can call on a student and it doesn't feel like a gotcha moment, because even if they don't know what to say, they can steal what their partner said. And I would never know. I want to take this to give you another example, and this from, it is again a poem. I'm using short text because I think that works best for this circumstance. But this is a picture book by Matt de la Peña.
Love is about the exploration of love in a child's life. I was very interested in showing love in unexpected contexts, places that you wouldn't traditionally see it. So the sound of your parents' voices is love. That's not something we normally hear somebody say, but I think it's true. What happens when there's a fall from grace in a child's life, and how do they recover love? How do they start to see it differently?
We all go through a journey in our life, experiencing love, recognizing love, seeing love in ourselves, and how even with all of our differences in the world, the common thread in our lives is love. The book's important to me because it's hopeful. As the person given the challenge to illustrate it, diving into Matt's words and the profoundness and the themes and the meaning really revealed to me the importance of love.
So when I originally wrote this book, it was just this little poem exploring the idea of love. And it wasn't until I saw Lauren's illustrations that I understood how it's a picture book. And the visual story just blows me away. And I'm so proud to be working with Lauren on this book. This one's my favorite because I think when a child discovers that there's love inside of them, then they're ready to go out into the world. But you can't go out into the world until you can look in the mirror and see love. I'm going to read a few pages from the book to you now. In a crowded concrete park, you toddle towards summer sprinklers while older kids skip rope and run up the slide. And soon you are running among them, and the echo of your laughter is love.
One night the fire alarm blares. You're pulled from sleep and whisked out into the street, where a quiet old lady is pointing to the sky. Stars shine long after they've flamed out, she tells you, and the shine they shine with is love.
One day you find your family nervously huddled around the TV, but when you ask what happened, they answer with silence and shift between you and the screen.
In your dream that night, you're searching for a love that seems lost. You open and close drawers, lift cushions, empty old toy bins, but there's nothing.
You wake with a start in the arms of a loved one who bends to your ear and whispers, It's okay. It's okay. It's love. What I love about picture books is that you're exploring these things with your child in your lap often, and it's a safe place to explore sometimes things that aren't perfect or aren't beautiful.
What I would love for kids to take away from this book is that love isn't just what they experience in their own bubble. They'll see so many different forms of love, that they can contribute love, not just passively receive love in your bubble, but they can add love to the world and contribute to it.
This message of love is important, especially now. I don't think we tell our kids we love them enough. We're living in divisive times. Every time you turn on the news, it's something negative. We're so caught up in everything that's happening in the world that sometimes I feel like we don't even see our children the way we used to. So I hope this book is us seeing them and telling them that we love them.
So there was one of the double-page spreads in this book was extremely controversial. The publishers didn't want to include this. Take a minute and just look at this closely. What do you think makes this image controversial, and why do you think Matt de la Pena and Lauren Long fought so hard to include it?
I think the drink on the piano, and he looks scraggly and leaving. So it comes across as a very intense topic.
The mother's
flipped over, the lamp is down, like obviously some domestic dispute that happened.
And I can't tell you how many times I was looking at this picture before I realized the chair was turned over. I just didn't quite see it. I was focused on the father stomping out, the mother in tears, the little boy under the piano. Notice too, the metronome is moving.
Yeah.
So somebody was playing the piano just seconds ago. And what the argument that the author and illustrator made to their publisher was, kids need to know they're not alone. And that's part of, again, what literature provides and helps them see that, the puppy's helping them get through this, and that is love. And that people who love each other sometimes say terrible things to one another, and it happens. So you might invite students to describe a situation where you observed or experienced love. Now, what could happen in a real classroom is students write things like, love is a hot dog, period. That's it. And you don't know what to do with that. So an idea that I saw on Larry Ferlazzo's blog, by the way, Larry Ferlazzo is an Education Week blogger. He talks a lot about working with English language learners. I strongly recommend it. And he was showcasing this chart from Deborah Hanson, helping students expand their sentences. So, start with something like love is a hot dog. Okay, let's see if we can expand that. We stood outside for 20 minutes. To add an adjective, we stood outside for 20 miserable minutes. When did it happen? This morning we stood outside for 20 miserable minutes. Where did it happen? This morning we stood on the sidewalk in front of the school for 20 miserable minutes. How did it happen? This morning we stood shivering on a snow-covered sidewalk in front of the school for 20 minutes. And why? This morning we stood shivering on a snow-covered sidewalk in front of the school for 20 miserable minutes while the fire chief investigated the cause of the fire alarm. Now, this is the kind of thing that you don't want to turn into a worksheet or a homework. You want to do it together often so that students get in the habit of seeing how it's possible to go past that just bare minimum and to take chances, to take risks as writers. And suddenly there's a richness to it. So again, let's imagine that you ask students to describe a situation where you experienced or saw love, and then maybe you do this expanding sentences exercise. Students work on their love is a hot dog sentence, but then you've got the the challenge, do you want to just collect all those papers? And what are you going to do with them? 10 points, 8 points? What if instead, in a similar way that book unfolded for us together, that you have what you might call a Quaker reading, and ask students to read what they've written when the Spirit moves them. Say that everybody has to speak up, but we might have quiet moments when nobody speaks up for a couple minutes. We might have moments when 2 people speak at once, just somebody sit down, somebody else stand up. And I think at that point, students feel their writing has been received. They don't need that extra 10 points. You might need to collect them because otherwise next time they might not do it. But all of this to say that often we make too much of assessment and not enough of making a place for student writing in the world. So I'm going to do something that I think also is a huge part of why I wrote the book in question, because I think there are also some things we are doing that have worked against students becoming readers and writers. Scholastic's survey, 2019 survey of many children, parents, has found this tremendous decline by 9. That suddenly when they reach 9 years old, kids, all the fun goes out of reading. It becomes work and they choose not to do it, or they choose to do fake reading. And as a result, their skills don't continue to develop. I don't know if some of you remember the Los Angeles Times initiative, Reading by 9. So there's an urgency to make sure all students can read. But what about students who choose to read? And so this is a cartoon that where a little girl's saying to her teacher, I've paraphrased, summarized, outlined, compared, contrasted, and inferred. Can I just read now? And think about this in terms of writing. They've filled out 10 graphic organizers, they've done an outline, they've done all these pieces. What about the actual act of writing? And I think that in this regard, it's as though we hide behind some of those things, those activities, because on the one hand, they seem like scaffolding to help struggling writers. But on the other hand, they take up classroom time that otherwise could be spent reading and writing. So I want to talk about some extraordinary books new books that are out. Because with every book students read, their world opens up just that bit wider and helps them understand why the world is the way it is. So I want to tell a story about this book. So it's a brand new biography by David Blythe of Frederick Douglass. And I don't usually read long 800-page nonfiction books. It's not what I usually do. But all the books I'm going to talk about today are nonfiction. Because one of the things that I think is holding students back from becoming the sophisticated writers they could be is that they don't read enough good nonfiction. But the story I want to tell about Frederick Douglass is, like, I read a lot, but I had to set myself daily goals. I was going to read 100 pages a day. And to tell that story to students, that you as somebody who they think just reads the way you breathe, no, sometimes this is a very compelling biography, but at the same time, it's very, very long. And it has a lot of citations and quotations. And again, it's like reading is fun and writing is fun. Sometimes it's work, but the satisfaction that comes from doing that work is tremendous. So the way I'm going to organize these books that I'm going to talk about is, let's say, middle school through high school. So the first book I want to talk about is Rising Water, the story of the Thai cave rescue. Mark Aronson is an accomplished award-winning writer of nonfiction for middle school readers. He wrote When Sugar Changed the World. And this book was written with, this rescue just happened last year. It was written within months of the rescue. And what he captures so well is the drama of it and the politics of it, which were of the rescue. But the book is full of diagrams. He also wrote, and he had good background for writing this story because he'd written a book called Trapped about the Chilean miners that were caught below for young readers. And in both cases, lots of photos, lots of diagrams, so you could actually see how it works. One of the things I appreciated the best, though, about his stories, he has an author's note at the end where he talks about the limitations of his own book. He said, I don't read Thai, so there are a lot of sources I did not have access to. And he said, because the rescue was so politically charged, more information will come out over time, and there will be other books written about it. And I thought, wow, if that's not something that I want student writers to see, this is the best I can do, this is all I know for now. Later, I may know more. Anything Philip Hoos writes is outstanding. His latest book, Addicts, Oscar Robertson and the Basketball Team That Awakened a City, is an absolute extraordinary book. No one that you know knows or cares less about basketball than me. I mean, I don't really understand what the name works. But this story is about so much more than it is about basketball. But what I learned about the Ku Klux Klan in Indiana, about this high school that was created to be a segregated high school, and that only when this high school's basketball team began winning the state tournaments, which is a very big deal in Indiana. Can't see why, but anyway, they care a lot about high school basketball. And I guess not a lot going on. Sorry, teachers in Indiana. Sorry, I apologize. But it becomes a story of the Great Migration as it tells Oscar Robinson's family story. You learn so much more. And one of the things that I found interesting, so there are quite long passages about individual games that Oscar Robinson played. I kind of skimmed those. But why? Because I lacked the background knowledge to animate those pages. And it's such a good example of reading comprehension is closely linked to the background knowledge you bring. So your students, many of whom are maybe reluctant readers, would bring a lot of background knowledge to this story. Another nonfiction book by Gail Jago, whom you may know, she's written up till now mostly about diseases. Plague, about pellagra, about a typhoid Mary. Her latest book is called Spooked, and it's how a radio broadcast in the War of the Worlds sparked the 1938 invasion of America. What she does, again, in great specific detail, is tell the story of H.G. Wells and Orson Welles and the creation of this. But the question at the heartbeat of this book is, how could so many people be fooled? The people who create Orson Welles and company never imagined that people would believe it. And so then what Gail Jarrow's book does is talk about news and how so much of what appears to be real in today's news cycles and online stories has the potential to trick readers. And so it becomes about how was it that some people were tricked and other people weren't in this particular case. Another book, and this book won all kinds of awards from the American Library Association last year. It's called A Few Red Drops, the Chicago Race Riot of 1919. You know, the best nonfiction employs all the same tricks and tools that good fiction does. So it starts with this dramatic moment in the hot Chicago summer of 1919, and this is when the beaches were still segregated. Group of black boys in the water find themselves in the white section, and someone starts throwing rocks from the shore, killing one of the boys. And what happens is that nobody does anything to stop the person who threw the rocks, so it leads to a riot on the beach, and then a riot throughout the city. Well, so the book starts with that moment, but then winds you back to talk about employment of the Pullman porters and in the stockyards, and how the resentment of many union so the union wouldn't allow African Americans into the union. So when they went on strike, many African Americans took those jobs. So there's resentment. We need to help our students understand that history is complicated, and how you find your way out of these situations into a better world is not going to be a simple fix. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. A particularly Californian story was written Duska Slater's book, The 57 Bus. And if you can test the water about this story, she wrote a long, maybe 15-page article for the New York Times Magazine section before she wrote the book. It's a story of Sasha, who identifies as asexual, and Richard, two teenagers in San Francisco riding the same bus home from school. Sasha, who wears skirts, he falls asleep at the back of the bus, and he's reading Anna Karenina. He falls asleep. Richard, who's there with a bunch of his friends, horsing around, flicks a light at this gauze skirt, and it goes up in flames. All of this, by the way, this is not conjecture. There was a CTV camera in the bus. Fortunately, there was a fireman on the bus. He does the brawl. Richard and his friends zip away, but they're caught within minutes by the police. And then this 16-year-old boy, who had been in some trouble but was making progress, doing better in school, is with a police officer, no parent, no lawyer, and is asked, "So, you don't like gays?" He goes, "No, not really." And suddenly it's a hate crime. And he could be charged with a hate crime and go to prison for the rest of his life. And it becomes a story both of Sasha and his recovery, and about the justice system. And what I think is so powerful about this story, it's about redemption. It's about how do we find a way, and also about these two boys living in the same city who are leading absolutely parallel, different existences in the same place. It's a wonderful story. You all know Dave Cullen from his book Columbine, which he was one of the reporters on the scene when the shooting happened, and was so appalled by how that played out in terms of the media response. Remember, it was live on CNN even as it was happening, that he spent the next 9 years of his life writing this book, which is utterly complete and exhaustive. I wish the book was shorter. I think it would be read more in high schools if it were shorter. But what happened, what occurred next, is that he became the nation's expert on school shootings. And so every time there's a school shooting, he would be brought in. And one of the things that people find most compelling about Columbine are his long psychological analysis of the two shooters. Well, over the course of these decades that have passed since, he has come to see that was a mistake, to focus on the shooters. And so his new book, Parkland, spends one paragraph and never actually even names the shooter. And instead, the book is about the students who stood up to it. And what I think for us in this institute and in our interest in terms of how do we empower students really to think about writing as one of the most empowering tools, because that's what these students had. They went to high school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. There's a very rich side of town, privileged school. These kids had drama and debate, and they brought to this defining moment in their lives a reservoir of literacy that is extraordinary, particularly in the way that they hope to change the world, but maybe even more importantly, that assisted in their own healing, because there was something they could do. The way they mobilized. I can't think of a better example of, let's say, what I would want for my students to be able to do what they've done and really focus on this. Another book that if I were in charge of the world, I would buy for every middle and high school classroom is this book, High, Everything You Want to Know About Drugs, Alcohol, and Addiction. It's written by the father-son team who are part of Beautiful Boy. The movie was terrible. Don't watch the movie. But the book is interesting. It would have been better if it were 200 pages instead of 300 pages. So it's a story of a young man who becomes addicted. And you don't understand why. It's not as though there are any troubles in his life. Okay, he had kind of an odd childhood where his mother, he spent some summers and holidays with his mom in LA and went to school with his dad in San Francisco. How hard is this? Like he's on an airplane back and forth. This wasn't a obviously troubled life. The father and son had a relationship, but it's about the power of addiction and the cost, the human cost to the family. Well, the boy, Nick Sheff, lived. And he and his father have put together this book that is the best, to me, book about what happens. Because it's not waving a finger at kids. It's not just saying no. Instead, it's things like a story that Nick will tell. Well, you're going to be at a party, and people are going to offer you this, that, and the other. And here's some cool ways to say no. And just that kind of practicality. And then facts about what happens to your brain, what happens to your body, why it's so critical when addiction happens while your brain is still forming, like you lose the ability. All teenagers have difficulty making decisions, let alone making good decisions. And this is impairing those those neural pathways that are still forming. For older kids, like maybe AP language class, I really recommend Beth Macy's book, Dope Sick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America. I think some of our best nonfiction today is being written by journalists because they know how long your attention span is. And so they don't get into the weeds too much. And they also know that we need to hear stories to attach these. But this is such a powerful argument about doctors overprescribing, patients kind of bullying the doctors into this. She is just a remarkable, Purdue Pharma, this really nails the corruption and the incentives that Purdue Pharma gave to doctors to do this. It's a really important story. Another book that I think, Elizabeth Partridge has written this book, Boots on the Ground, America's War in Vietnam. What she's done is take 8 stories, 6 American soldiers, 1 Vietnamese refugee, and 1 nurse, and she tells their stories that happen over the long period of time that Vietnam unfolded, the Vietnam War unfolded, but also interspersed in those stories are facts, data, 100 pictures. I think that today's students, one this is a better way for them to take in information than, let's say, the 800-page biography that I had to challenge myself to do. But two, provide interesting models for their own writing. The inclusion of visual text and multimedia pieces as part of a presentation of information. Last week, the New York Times had, in the book section, published the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years. And I think some of us have kind of pulled away from memoir in some ways, because what we were thinking when the latest standards movement told us we need more nonfiction, but not just narrative nonfiction, and of course, memoir is narrative. But I think it's time to come back. You know, education is about, we take 2 steps forward and then we take 1 step back to rethink that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Because, you know, Tom Newkirk has written that effective informational writing must be memorable, consequential, dramatic, surprising, personal, facts embedded in story, facts with emotional weight. We don't take in information raw. Our minds are made for stories. And that's what these great memoirs like Tara Westover's Educated do. So she takes us into her world of growing up in a survivalist family, where you're shocked. You almost can't believe you're reading nonfiction, and tells her story of what it was like to grow up. She didn't have a birth certificate, because by the time they got to her, the parents she never went to school, and she ends up getting a PhD from Oxford. It's a remarkable story, really, really well told. Most of the books that I've been talking about are newly published, but I sure don't want us to forget about some of the most extraordinary memoirs that are out there. This appeared on the New York Times list, and it's Jesmyn Ward who won the National Book Award, both for Salvage the Bones and for her more recent Sing Unburied Sing. Those are both fiction. This is a memoir based on a year in her life when 5 of her brother and 4 friends that she knew very well all died of circumstances that had to do with growing up Black in Mississippi, where they were. And it's written with such heart-wrenching detail and exquisite language that you really, really can't put it down. I love Sing Unburied Sing. I think it should be on every AP literature list. But I also think that this story is something that is, I don't want to get forgotten. One memoir that didn't appear on that list that I really, really think should, and that if I were in a STEM school, I would absolutely put this on the list, is Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. You will never look at a tree the same way after you read this book. And what's so wonderful, so she's a scientist, but what she and had a hard, even though her father was a physicist and an academic, had a hard time, she also suffers from depression, but making her way in the world of science. But what she points out is the difficulty of doing creative science, because all the money in science is either in weapons or big pharma. And if what you want to do is like look at plants really closely, where does the money? She has been successful. She has her own lab. She finally was able to establish her own lab. But the way she talks about her the way she writes about her passion for the natural world is just really, really amazing. Now, I also want to talk about another kind of memoir, which are memoirs in verse. So you know L'Oreal Halls Anderson from her book Speak. What you might not know, so Speak was written 20 years ago. And it is the story of a girl entering 9th grade who goes to a party in the summer, with older kids, has a few beers, and is raped. And then she spends all 9th grade not speaking. Shout is Laurie Halse Anderson's telling her own story of that experience and what consent means. Definitely for older kids, it's too heavy for middle school, in my opinion. But it is a work of art. It is a much greater work of art than Speak is. I mean, just saying. That was 20 years ago. Laurie Halse Anderson has developed it as a writer. This is an amazing book. I also think Hey Kiddo, How I Lost My Mother, Found My Father, and Dealt with Family Addiction. Interestingly, Jared Kroskaska is in the process of recording this as an audio book. And so it's a story of a boy whose mother is an addict. He grows up with his grandparents. Okay, they're kind of wackadoodle, but it's a decent life that he leads. But it's about shame. And how as a child, he always carried this with him, that he wasn't like the other kids around. And the other interesting thing about this memoir, it's not told from an older person's point of view. He tells it from the perspective of being a senior in high school at his own graduation. And one more book. This is a graphic memoir by Thuy Bui, The Best We Could Do. Santa Monica High School has used this for its all school reads a summer reading book this summer. So I'll let you know how that goes. I think it was a very edgy thing to do, but it's the story, to me, the story of personal trauma. And so what her parents go through to bring her and her sisters to this country. And it's not always pretty how that plays out in terms of personal relationships, that it really was the best they could do. And I'll close with the thought, because the Defender, the iconic African-American newspaper in Chicago, closed its doors yesterday. Students who read more know more. And students who know more are able to do more, including able to write more. We need to make sure that our students' lives are full of books, full of opportunities to write, and to write about things they care about. Thank you so much for everything you do to make sure that happens with students. Thank you. And we're going to have some questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have
We have several from.
Okay, we're going to do sort of virtual and then in the room and virtual. So you go ahead with the first question.
Top of Maine asks, how do you develop resiliency in the classroom? Like, what sort of activities do you suggest?
And I'm assuming when you ask, how do you develop resiliency, it's also about stamina and working through issues. One way is by admitting my own shortcomings, by talking about how hard it is for me, how many drafts something took for me, because the reason students give up is that they think it's so much easier for other people. So I also think it helps to invite students to tell the story of their paper, to write about how did it go for you. So this allows a student who knows they're turning in a paper that isn't great, but to give you some background about the struggles, the storm and German storm that they've gone through to get where they are.
In the room.
Yes.
You obviously have a wealth of knowledge about books. And one of my questions is, how do you find the books that you read? It seems like you actually read them all, which is phenomenal. How do you do that? And I'm an elementary school teacher, so they're smaller books, but where do you find all these brand new books?
So the question is, where do you find books? How do you know where to begin? I pay a lot of attention to book awards. and not just the book that wins the first, but all of the honor books, everything the American Library Association does, National Book Circle Awards, Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize, and I think that, and when you say, I think you've actually read them, I've read 10 books for every one that's good enough to tell anybody else about, but I don't waste my breath talking about books that are rubbish. I put down books if 30 pages in, it's not doing anything for me. Oh, well, I spent $26, there we go. My time is more valuable than what it costs. And I think I have just a commitment, because I know how busy teachers are, that I can do this. And so let me do it and to try to put it forward. My book includes about 450 recommendations at the back, and I could add another 100 to that tomorrow. So I think that this is why I was brought into the world, I think, to talk about books. Another question from online.
Yes. Lisa from Washington State asks, what are your thoughts about sustained silent reading and leveled reading? Like, how AR science fiction was sustained.
So the question was about how do I feel about sustained silent reading and then leveled reading. For students who aren't going to read any outside of classroom, you need to build that habit inside the classroom. Why does it get bad press? Because administrators, coaches go into a classroom that's supposed to be having silent, sustained reading, and half the kids have their heads down on their desk. So sustained silent reading needs to be a community event that is motivated by teacher doing book talks, students giving book talks. Kelly talked last week about interviews with kids, like conferencing with kids. It needs to be interactive. In terms of leveling, I leave that controversy to people who know much more about teaching reading than I do. But I will say I was in a middle school library in a district which will remain nameless 2 weeks ago, and every book in the library had its color tag. And I worried a lot because that didn't feel like a library to me. That didn't feel like where the openness of browsing, or even where it's easier to find books by what we know. So I think I have concerns, but I also believe that every program that's out there was not invented to punish kids, but they're trying to do good things too. And so if you're in a school where this is the program that you are, to find what's good about it and to just keep helping kids pick up a book and find their own path. You had a question. Oh, okay. Liz.
There's this movement afoot just now to disrupt the canon, and you talk about that a little bit in your book, but you also later write about the importance of having students wrestle with those big pieces of literature. So what I'm interested in is what's the balance?
Balance is the key word. I think that one of the most interesting things about disrupting text is the idea of coming to some iconic works with a different lens, inviting different kinds of questions than we might have ever approached. So the obvious one is To Kill a Mockingbird, and to think about it as a white savior image, and that this is going to bring new life to me and to the works. And there's a history of this. Think about Ethan Hawke's Hamlet. That where to be and not to be is happening in a video store. Not that there are any video stores anymore, but like it's that kind of bring a different lens to the work. What I don't think we should do is to beat into the ground young adult books, because one, we'll ruin them. We'll stop talking about foreshadowing. And, and we'll also take 9 weeks, 8 weeks to teach them. And these are books that are meant to be consumed quickly, gobbled up by. Do I want kids talking about them? Absolutely, yes. But they don't need me to parse it out chapter by chapter, quiz by quiz, and then a big paper at the end.
Yes, Henry from Montana asks, what about reading across the curriculum?
Reading what?
Across the curriculum? Because, just writing across the curriculum, but he's saying reading across the curriculum, like, do you think there's a responsibility, a heavy burden on English teachers to teach reading as well, that other disciplines are not carrying?
In the same way that writing in the disciplines is different from literary analysis, so reading in the disciplines is often different from reading a novel or a poem. And so, in my experience, the best content area teachers who are aware of developing a literacy in their own content area are helping students read like a scientist, read like a historian, read the work, which is a different. You read informational text differently from a novel. If you don't finish a novel, you haven't read the book. Often in an informational text, you're looking for something. So you're skipping around. You don't need to read the whole thing. And these are the kind of things that would only happen in a content area class. As an English teacher, for whom most of my friends are English teachers, yes, we believe we carry the weight of the world in terms of literacy. But and it would be nice if other people helped in any way they could. Yes.
I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade honors, language arts, and I was wondering if you had 3 books respectively that you think absolutely need to be taught.
So the question is, there's a middle school teacher, are there 3 books absolutely that need to be taught? And the answer is no. I think that so much depends upon the context of your classroom, and that can even change every single year. I think that if you don't know Greek mythology, if you never read the Odyssey, if you don't know Romeo and Juliet, you're going to miss a lot of jokes in the world. So I do think that there are some iconic works that 1984. But for a particular group, it so much depends on it. So much depends, you had said your group was an honors class. A lot depends on the parent community and what they are prepared to allow their middle school students to read. And that kind of creates a boundary. I was very fortunate my whole life. I worked in Santa Monica, Malibu School District. I taught school board members' children, principals' children. They knew me, they knew the classroom, they knew I was unlikely to do anything really stupid. And so they trusted me to make good decisions. But not everybody works into those circumstances.
In your book, you talk about the decision making that we are involved in as teachers, and one of the decisions is what books we're putting in front of our students. Can you share your thoughts about the relationship between the teacher making independent decisions, like you were suggesting to Jody, about what books are needed in her classroom, versus a grade level group deciding on texts that everybody's teaching? How do those two work together?
The question is about how do you make decision making? And I always think we're stronger together. That to bounce off, even though maybe it's only my class that's going to read this book, but to talk to my colleagues, to talk to others, the challenge is to find other colleagues who've read this book. If it's something I'm thinking about using, but have some concerns with. But no, you need another pair of eyes, because one, it's a huge investment. If you're going to teach a book, you're buying all of it. It's an investment of money, but it's an investment of classroom time. I can't get those 4 weeks back that I just spent with a book that actually isn't working very well. Carol.
So I sense from the book that you are somewhat hesitant of strategy instruction.
and yet the research around strategy and instruction is amazingly robust. And you do think that kids need to be metacognitive. So given that, how do you help kids become metacognitive in your classroom?
I always think about how strategies came out of the spirit of let's show struggling readers what good readers do transparently. And so that spirit still holds true. Let's show students this the most powerful reading strategy of all, rereading. You know, but it doesn't have a cool graphic organizer or acronym, KWL, BYOB, you know, and so as a result, we forget that rereading is actually the thing that good readers know to do, to slow down, to read to punctuation. My criticism of strategy instruction is that we spend all day practicing for a day that never comes. Like we break it down, we help kids get good at strategies instead of simply becoming the kind of readers who know what to do. And I am so guilty of some of these things, of having kids with chart paper and markers and spending a lot of time drawing things. And that can be good, but we always need to balance instructional time versus the learning that happened as a result of that. Any more from online?
That's right. One just came in. In terms of struggling readers, like how do you help a student who may still need to decode, like learn how to decode, and like they're like in ninth grade?
Issues of decoding need special help, individual help. I don't think any program alone solves a problem for a student that's in middle or high school and still can't physically read. I do think, however, that many more students simply have never read enough to get good at it. So it's their fluency that's suffering, and then they've never seen a book that appealed to them, that they brought enough background knowledge to. I'll never forget one day, somebody, I think Arte Publico Press sent me some advanced reader's copy, and the book was called Quinceañera, with a girl in a beautiful dress on. Oh my God, that disappeared in a heartbeat. And it really opened my eyes to the responsibility is on me to find books that students might reach for. We're seeing that a lot with graphic novels right now. Any librarian will tell you these are the books that are flying off the shelves. And some people are saying, whoa, I don't know if that's real reading. Anything that can bring a struggling reader to the pages of a book is a step in the right direction. Yes?
I think oftentimes teachers feel like they're on an island, just like that question indicated. What are some of the resources that people can go to that maybe they're not expecting or they're not seeing when you're stuck and you're thinking, oh, this is all my responsibility?
The question is that so many teachers feel they're on an island, and what are some resources? I think there are, one, the community of a writing project. I mean, could there be a better family of professionals, all of whom are willing to accept this is unperfectible. I can't operate in next year I'll get it right. No, honestly, next year you might do the dumbest thing you ever did in the classroom. But as long as you're somebody who approaches teaching with, I'm going to learn from that, I'm going to try. I taught Julius Caesar 28 times, and about number 26, I gave the worst assessment I've ever given. I collect the papers, I'm looking at them at home, and they were dreadful, but the fault was mine, because my prompt was so ridiculous, and so no wonder they couldn't focus. I went into class the next day, and I said, students, I did this. I'm just going to give you all A's. Oh, they were so happy. Now, what does that A mean? I control the grade, the point system. But it was an acknowledgement that I had made a mistake. So I think California Association of Teachers of English, or your state affiliates in other states, the National Council of Teachers of English, writing projects, reading projects, the history, social studies project, that these communities, and now they're more and more online. Project Lit, the Disrupt Text group, that can help you participate professionally. Some online communities can become toxic. You just move in a different direction. You know, so it's take the same advice you'd give to students. If the conversation is going in a path you don't want to go, just not look. And then I also think that the most powerful communities are the ones that are closest to home. So in your own departments, in your own schools, to try to build community. And in my experience, one of the best ways to build that community is with a book club. So you, instead of talking about the terrible kids that you got this year and what they had you last year, let's read a book. Let's read a book together. And we found in my department, we found such, I'm going to say, divisions about how we saw a character in a novel, that suddenly I started to understand the basis for a lot of the issues we were having as a department.
Yeah. One more question?
We do have one.
Yes?
I have a question just about adopting texts in your district. So a lot of the texts you had recommended are more modern and updated than the ones that are being taught in my district. So do you have any tips or anything about getting them on
So
board?
the question is about getting books adopted. The distinction is between books in your classroom library that you're just, and that you may be having reader circles about, but any book that you'd want to teach to the class, you'd have to have adopted. You need a system in place. You need a process. Again, to Catherine's point, you don't want to go out there alone, and people need to commit to reading. I made reference to Santa Monica High School has a all-school summer reading program. This is a year-long enterprise by the English department to narrow a list down to 3 books. Everybody reads it and then chooses. So we need to do these things as a community rather than by ourselves.
There was one more on the line, so let's do that for the last one.
Would you say that the power of reading provides us with perspective taking and point of view that's much needed in our classrooms?
I think reading opens up our eyes to other people's existence. Teenagers particularly are extraordinarily solipsistic, and they hang around with kids that are just like them, and they don't look outside of themselves. That's our job. Not to pander to students' interests, but rather to help students to be interested in a host of things they never imagined they'd be interested in before, including the suffering of others across history, across time, across cultures, because teenagers are acutely aware when things are unfair. And so to capitalize that, to help them see and make them want to do things, that's how we're going to change the world. That's how we're going to hope that the next generation can solve some problems that we've made for them. Thank you again, Carol. Thank you for everybody for coming in. This was fun.